Now this is a quick tour of how to use the Microsoft Labs Online, or the MLOs. And as you can see here, I'm starting off in the Open edX console. And what I'll do is take a look at the first lab in Module 2. That's entitled Joining Windows 10 to Azure AD. And it's just not important which module I use for this lab or this demo. There are 11 in this lab, but I'm doing this for demonstration purposes only. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on the lab topic here in the left margin. And then up here in the ribbon, I'm going to go and find the topic for launching the lab, and here it is, how to launch the lab. So I'll click on that. Now this is the same approach for all labs in this course, and I'll go ahead and click the Launch Lab button down here. And it's here that I receive a notification that I'm about to have my username and email sent to a third-party application. And I trust this process, so I'm going to go ahead and click OK and move ahead. And this launches a separate browser instance that hosts the Microsoft Labs Online session. And this takes approximately 2 to 3 minutes to load. Obviously, for this demo, I'm speeding it up. And we're eventually taken to the hosted virtual machine, or VMs, for this lab. While we're here, let's go ahead and take a couple of minutes to become familiar with the navigation and features that are common to all the MLO lab experiences. First, I'm going to go up here where it says Actions. And you'll see 4 listings. There's Control-Alt-Delete, the Windows key, Windows charms, and paste content. Now, Control-Alt-Delete is the same behavior as you'd be doing from a literal console. So if I were to sign out or switch user or even take a look at Task Manager, those are the kind of things you'd do from an actual Windows 10 desktop, and you can get to that using Control-Alt-Delete. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to select the Windows key. And that's working just as expected, just as if I'd gone down here and pressed the Windows key in the left-hand corner, or perhaps even the Windows key on my keyboard. And it does this. Now I'm going to go over and switch over to the virtual machine that's running for this lab, and that's called Lawn DC1, and that's not important, but keep in mind sometimes you'll be in these virtual machine environments and there'll be more than one, so this is where you select between the 2 machines, or potentially 3 for some of these labs. And this helps me to show the Charms button, so I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And that's for our Windows 2012 server. And that can come in handy for such things as search, start, and settings, as you see here. Now back to our Windows 10 client, that's Lawn CL1 for this lab. And I can do that by doing this. And the last one here is the paste command selection. And it does exactly what you'd expect. It pastes the content from the clipboard into your VM. So you can think of this as kind of a Control-V kind of accelerator key command equivalent. Now let's take a look here. This is the network performance indicator, and it displays the response rate between the browser, which is what I'm looking at here, and the virtual machine. And as you can guess, more bars, the better the performance. What's displayed now is the round-trip ping in milliseconds, 43 in our case. And you can refresh that by hitting this refresh button, just like this, and it looks like the rate of the network speed is pretty good. Just went up a bit. Okay, what next? How about over here? This is the listing for the course, the name of the lab instance. Helpful if you're ever in need of support, folks, for troubleshooting a lab. And speaking of that, let's drop down here in the support section, where there are listings for contacting support as seen here. You see a FAQ, or FAQ. Next, I'm going to click on the hide button up here, like this, and notice the screen gets a bit larger, and I'll do it again just to bring it back to the original screen where you see the upper controls, and that just makes this VM that's being displayed here easier to see and perhaps a bit less cluttered if you're not using those controls. Okay, the last thing I'm going to do before we do the walkthrough of the labs is go up here in the right hand corner. It's probably the most important part of this demo actually, and you see here user guide and lab steps. Now first, the user guide, if you take a look at that, then you have access to the guide, and explains pretty much what we're doing in this demo, and then goes into greater detail. So it's a good place to go if you're interested in actually how everything in this lab works. Okay, the real important one though is the lab steps. So let's go look at that. And these are the lab steps for getting through all 11 labs in this course. So every time you come into a lab, it's probably the first thing I do is I turn these on. And you'll always have these available from the edX console as well. So if you're clicking this lab steps and you're going through it, it's essentially the same thing as you'd see in the console for the procedure. and that's where we launched from the OpenEdX instance to here. If you flip back there, you'll notice there are the steps as well as videos for walking through these labs. It's really important to note here that there are 11 courses, but of those 11 courses, 6 of those are scored for your final overall score for the course. And there's more on this in the previous video on how to use the assessment, so please see that video. Then you'll understand how this is scored. But the takeaway here is there are 6 labs that are scored. You need to use these lab steps in order to get through that, and I'll show that in a demo in a moment. But really, you're going to want to click on every box here all the way to the end of the lab, and that way you'll be able to run the self-assessment. And the only way to get scored on this lab is to actually click all these boxes and run through the self-assessment. Now, sometimes you get partially through a lab, and for whatever reason, you want to leave, say you have an appointment, or it's just not going well. It's not a bad idea to go all the way through. Just click all these boxes anyway, and then do the self-assessment. The only time that's a bad idea is if you have a pretty good score. So let's say you got maybe 5 out of 6 for this lab, and you go back to redo the lab. You run the risk of actually dropping it down to something like 2 or 3 out of 6. So make sure when you actually are redoing a lab, your intent is to get a better score. And we'll see that in action in just a moment. Now I'm going to begin by working through all these steps. And in order to do that, I need to complete all the exercises. I believe this lab has 3 exercises. And so obviously I'm going to speed this up for the demo. And you'll notice here at the end of this exercise, there's a marker here letting me know that it is the end of the exercise, as well as a button to move on to the next exercise. And we're also reminded here that in order to pass the self-assessment, then we need to go through all the steps, and they must be taken. And I've done that so far, so I'm going to click on Next Exercise and keep working through this lab and continue through fairly quickly and until I'm finally at the end of the lab. And here it says End of Lab. That's how I know. And I've made sure that all these steps have been checked off, and that's very important. Otherwise, the Take Self-Assessment button won't appear, and this course is important because you can't get a score unless you take the self-assessment, and you won't see this button unless you've clicked all these little boxes here. So it's as easy as that. So if you find yourself in that position where the Take Self-Assessment button isn't there, you need to go back, and you can arrow back using the previous screen or the previous section, and just make sure you're checking off all those boxes, and then when you come back, you'll be able to do that. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and take the assessment now and click the button, and notice that it tells me here that I'm about to be graded, and that's what I want. Now, it's important to note here that even if I feel like I didn't do this perfectly or have complete success, I still want to check off all the boxes and get some, and hopefully maybe all of it, of the credit. And then what I'm saying is it's possible to receive partial credit, and you know, in these labs, partial credit's a good thing, so think about that. You don't have to be a perfectionist. At any rate, I'm going to click Yes and see how I've done. And this takes anywhere from 2 to 4 minutes to complete, but I'm going to speed that up. And here we are. Here's my result. Now, it looks pretty good. There are 7 criterion here, and green indicates success. Otherwise, it would have been pink, and I'll show you that in a moment. In fact, I'll show you that right now. Here's what it looks like in a separate lab that I did earlier in the day. And as you can see here, I didn't do too well, and in fact, I missed doing most of the scored tasks correctly. And this is a demo, so I'm off the hook. But notice there's a listing for the lab task, so you can revisit that. And then there's a result telling me if I did the task correctly, or in some cases here, incorrectly, and a reason why it might be incorrect. So I can now revisit and retry, but walk through the lab again with particular attention to these areas where I obviously need to improve. So now I'm going to jump back over to the Progress tab, and you'll see here in this case I've done labs 2, 3, and 4, and not a great showing in any of those, but progress nonetheless, and that's what I mean by getting the partial credit. And I intend on doing some of these labs later in hope of improving those scores, but do keep in mind that you can retake a lab and self-assess to improve the score. But there's also that possibility that if I retake a lab and my lab assessment drops, that means I receive the lower score. So before you click that self-assessment button, when retaking a lab, it's good to feel pretty confident about your chances for improvement. Otherwise, it just might be lower, and there's nothing can be done about that unless you want to try again. But here in this demo, we just went through that first lab, and we had good success. And notice my overall score right now, my total is 7% over here. So I'm going to do a quick refresh. And here it is. It shows that I have the full credit here. So this histogram's to the top. And that means I've moved through the lab and did all that I was asked. And notice that the total has increased from 7% to 13%. So that means I've contributed 13% toward my overall 70% goal for this course, and I've done that with just labs alone. So far, there's more to do. And do again, take a look at that previous video on how these assessments work, because the labs are just part of it. So okay, I'm just about done here. Before I drop off though, let me take a look down here a bit lower in the progress page, and you'll see here there are 3 labs, and the key here is that the term problem score right here, this means that these 3 labs belong in a category of scored labs for this course, and of course there are 6 scored labs out of the 11 for this course. Down here in Module 3 you'll see 2 more of the problem score, which means they're graded as well. Moving further down, Module 4 shows 2 labs, but both of those have practice scores, and what that means is they're not scored in the overall assessment, but you can still do that self-assessment process to understand how you did in the lab, so you'll get results back, but they do not get scored. And to keep moving, down here's Module 5, there's practice scores again, and then down here in Module 6 you'll see there's the last lab with a problem score, so that means it's going to be scored. So that counts. And just for the record, it's the toughest lab, this one down here, and it takes the most time, so diligence is needed for this one, and we often see people getting partial scores on this one. So keep that in mind. It's a tough one. So that's it. That's the quick tour of Microsoft Labs Online. That's the UI, self-assessments, and the lab scoring. And remember, you can't receive credit for a lab unless you actually walk through the lab, take the steps, and take the self-assessment.